Okay, so what led to the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the empire? Was it the unaliving of this dude right here, Julius Caesar, and the subsequent civil wars that followed? Well, here's the thing. You could make that argument, but it's kind of short-sighted. The foundations of the decline started centuries before Julius Caesar was even born. By the end of the 4th century BC, Rome was starting to become a powerhouse in central Italy. This is a far cry from what it would be during the imperial age, so just keep that in mind. Like, yes, they're powerful, but not as powerful as you think they are. The Republic's army was comprised of citizen soldiers who were typically farmers during non-war times. And then they would pick up arms once Rome got involved in its many, many wars. And this system is very different than the professional soldiers that would come along a few centuries later. The soldiers of the Republic were landowners and had a vested interest in fighting for their homeland. And being a good Roman was vital and was instilled into them at a very young age. And this system worked because typically campaigns weren't fought very far from where the soldiers' farms were. But in the 3rd century BC, this begins to change. The Roman legions start facing off against non-Italian enemies, starting with Pyrrhus of Epirus in southern Italy, and then against the Carthaginians in the Punic Wars, as well as against Hellenistic powers during the First Macedonian War. So what's the big deal? Why am I saying all of this? Because of the consequences. Because you have fighting in Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, North Africa, Spain, and Greece, as well as Italy. The legions are sent all over the place, and these places are very, very far from home. And the legionaries were gone for a really long time, leaving their farms to dilapidation. A far cry from looking like this. But there's also another force at play here. By the end of the 3rd century BC, Rome controlled much more than this. Here's the territory that fell under Roman control at around 200 BC. And although this area right here in North Africa isn't red, it pretty much was controlled by Rome. In all but name only. But back to the consequences. What does this mean? Well, primarily 2 things. Number 1, plunder. This was a huge reason to go off on campaigns, as soldiers could come back relatively wealthy. But not necessarily, and I'll get to that in a second. And number 2, slaves. You could make the argument that they're just a human form of plunder, but I'm delineating them because they're human beings. But you see, not all of the spoils of war were fairly distributed. The Roman senatorial class in particular got extremely wealthy during the 2nd century BC. And this was a combination of a few things, but one of the major reasons was the spoils of war, as the Roman high command in the military was comprised of almost exclusively the senatorial class. But let's go back to the citizen soldier here. He comes back from fighting in a faraway war for years and finds his farm just dilapidated. What happens? Well, these now poor farmer soldiers are forced to sell their farms for pennies on the denarius. And throughout the 2nd century BC, a lot of these folks with nowhere to go head to Rome. And these soldiers, with their families, with nowhere else to go, end up heading to Rome. And not like the colloquial sense of Rome, but I mean the actual city itself, where the urban population just expands dramatically. And who is buying up all of this land, you might ask? Do I even need to say, or is it kind of obvious? So not only do they have the resources to actually buy up all the land and farm, but they also have the slave labor to work the farm. So these absolutely massive estates are just being worked on by slaves, and they don't need to actually hire labor. Oh, and to make matters worse, they were even doing this on publicly owned land that they kind of just took for themselves. And then the Publicani come around. Okay, so who the heck are they? The Publicani were, in essence, tax collectors, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. The Roman state would sell off contracts to private enterprises. These contracts allowed these enterprises to essentially collect taxes on behalf of the state. The state gets money up front, and then these guys go out and actually collect the taxes themselves. But the Publicani were incentivized to collect as much as possible, increasing their profit margins. And the Publicani aren't going after these guys. Oh, heck no. They're way too powerful. They go after these dudes, who now not only lost their land, but have to pay more than their fair share in taxes. You can kind of see how this is all a big problem. Towards the end of the 2nd century BC, you had people that tried to address the systemic inequality. It didn't go well for them, though. Not at all. A notable example is the Gracchi brothers. They both had really ambitious reforms that were never realized, because one was brutally unalived in the middle of the day, and the other one was forced to unalive himself. And as the 2nd century BC comes to a close, there aren't a lot of citizen soldiers left. And here is where we see the beginning of the professional soldier. Previously, citizen soldiers were loyal to the Republic. The new professional soldiers were loyal to the people that paid them, i.e. the generals they served under. And the big consequence of this? Civil war on civil war on civil war in the 1st century BC. By the time of Julius Caesar, and especially by the time of Augustus, Romans hated democracy and republicanism, because they just equated that with civil war, and they were sick of it. And when Augustus essentially becomes the first emperor, although back then that's not what they called it, people were clamoring for him to be dictator for life, as they didn't want him to step down and then return to the civil wars that they had just lived their entire lives through. People were clamoring for democracy to end. Just let that sink in for a moment. So if people were to say that it was because of Caesar and Augustus that the Roman Republic ended, just know it's way more complicated than that.